In the span of just 48 hours, a small farming community near the outskirts of Oklahoma witnessed one of the most devastating natural disasters in their recent history. But this story is not just about the storm itself. It is about the choice one man made when everything he had built was at stake, and how a woman's desperate cry became the turning point that would either save lives or destroy them all. When nature shows its darkest face, humanity often reveals its truest colors. This is the story of two people who would learn that lesson in the most unforgettable way possible. The morning of September 14th began like any other day on the Hayes family's sprawling ranch. The sun rose over the vast plains of rural Oklahoma, casting long shadows across the red dirt roads that stretched for miles. James Hayes, a 53-year-old rancher who had spent every single day of his adult life working the land, stood on the porch of his weathered farmhouse with a cup of black coffee in his hand. His weathered face bore the lines of decades spent under the harsh sun, and his calloused hands told the story of a man who had never shied away from hard work. Next to him stood his wife of 30 years, Margaret, who had been born and raised in this very county. She was a woman of quiet strength, someone who had learned to read the land as well as her husband did. Their two children had long since moved to the city, pursuing careers that took them far away from the rural life their parents had chosen. But James and Margaret had never regretted their decision to stay. This land was their life, their legacy, and their home. On this particular morning, Margaret felt something in the air that made her uneasy. It was a feeling she had learned to trust over the years. She noticed the way the leaves on the old oak tree in their yard were hanging differently, the way the birds had stopped singing their usual morning songs, and the way the wind seemed to carry a peculiar heaviness to it. She mentioned her concerns to James as she set down his breakfast on the weathered wooden table. James listened to his wife with the respect he had always shown her opinions about the land. He walked to the window and looked toward the western horizon. The sky there was still relatively clear, but he too could sense the change in the atmosphere. Over the radio in the kitchen, the weather report had mentioned a potential storm system developing, but nothing that seemed immediately threatening. Still, in their years of living out here, both James and Margaret had learned that the plains could turn dangerous without much warning. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. James had work to do in the barn, checking on the livestock and ensuring that everything was secure. Margaret started her day tending to her vegetable garden, something she had maintained for all their years on the ranch. She grew tomatoes, peppers, squash, and beans, and she took great pride in the work. She had always said that there was something spiritual about putting your hands in the earth and watching things grow from nothing. Around noon, the wind began to pick up noticeably. Margaret was inside preparing lunch when she noticed the sudden change. The radio forecast had updated several times, and now there was talk of a significant weather system that was moving faster than originally predicted. A tornado watch had been issued for their county and several surrounding areas. James came in from his work, his shirt soaked with sweat, and they sat together listening to the increasingly urgent weather bulletins. The announcer's voice carried a note of concern that even reached through the radio speakers. Residents in certain areas were being advised to prepare shelter and to monitor the situation carefully. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky had taken on an ominous appearance. The green-tinted clouds that James and Margaret had both learned to fear were beginning to form on the western horizon. The wind was now strong enough to make the house creak and groan, and the temperature had dropped precipitously. James made a decision. He began to gather supplies from around the house. He checked their storm shelter, a reinforced basement room that they had built into the house specifically for situations like this. He brought in water, flashlights, batteries, a first aid kit, and some non-perishable food items. Margaret helped him, moving with a practiced efficiency that came from many years of these kinds of preparations. They had been through severe storms before, and while this one seemed to be shaping up to be particularly dangerous, they felt confident that their preparations would see them through. What they didn't know was that this storm would be different from anything they had previously experienced. The meteorologists tracking the system had begun to recognize the atmospheric conditions that suggested this could develop into a particularly violent tornado or multiple tornadoes. The storm system was moving through warm, moist air at lower levels and cold, dry air at upper levels, creating the perfect conditions for rotation and severe weather development. By mid-afternoon, the warnings had escalated from watches to actual tornado warnings for their specific area. The radio announcer's voice had taken on an almost frantic quality as more and more severe weather reports came in from spotters who were tracking the developing storm. Large hail the size of softballs had been reported in areas to the west of their location. Wind speeds were being estimated at over 100 miles per hour in some areas, and there was definitely rotation being detected on radar. James and Margaret decided that the time to take shelter had arrived. They secured the windows as best they could with some storm shutters they had installed years ago. James made one final circuit around the property, checking that the barn doors were secured as much as possible, though he knew that there was ultimately very little they could do to truly protect the structures if the storm proved to be as severe as it seemed it might be. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as the rain began to fall harder and the wind reached increasingly violent levels, they made their way to the shelter. James locked the main door behind them, and they descended the stairs into the basement room that had been their refuge during previous storms. The walls were concrete, and the room was positioned in such a way that it was as protected as any room in the house could be. Outside, the world was descending into chaos. The wind had reached speeds that were nearly impossible to imagine if you had never experienced them. Trees were being uprooted. The roofs of outbuildings were being lifted clean off their foundations. Debris was being thrown through the air like lethal projectiles. The sound of the storm was so loud that it seemed to fill every inch of existence. James and Margaret sat together on a bench in their shelter, listening to the fury of nature unleashing itself just beyond the concrete walls that surrounded them. James held his wife's hand, a gesture that was both reassuring and a way of grounding himself to something real and steady in the midst of the chaos. Margaret thought of their children in the city, safely far away from this terrible weather. She thought of the life they had built together on this land, and she wondered what would be left when the storm finally passed. The wind seemed to scream around the house, and James realized with a sense of dread that the sound it was making was different from anything they had heard before. It had a quality to it that suggested something far more violent than they had previously experienced. The concrete walls of their shelter seemed to shudder slightly with the force of the wind. Dust filtered down from where the shelter connected to the main structure of the house above. Hours seemed to pass, though in reality, the worst part of the storm only lasted for a matter of minutes. Time itself seemed distorted in the face of the storm's power. Then, gradually, the sound began to decrease. The shuddering of the shelter became less frequent. The screaming of the wind diminished to something that was merely intense rather than apocalyptic. Finally, after what had felt like an eternity, but was really only about an hour, the worst of the storm had passed. James cautiously ascended the stairs to the main level of the house. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The back section of the house had been completely destroyed. An entire wall was simply gone, as was the roof in that section. Debris was scattered everywhere. The force of the wind had driven straw and pieces of wood into walls with such force that they had penetrated deep into the material. Margaret came up behind him and let out a gasp of shock. Despite their preparations, despite their storm shelter, they now found themselves living in a house that was partially open to the elements. Outside, the landscape was transformed. Trees that had stood for decades were now snapped off like twigs. The entire structure of the barn was gone, reduced to scattered pieces of wood and metal that were strewn across the property. Livestock that had been sheltered inside was simply gone, swept away by the force of the wind. But they were alive. That was the most important thing in that moment. As James looked at his wife covered in dust from the debris that had filtered into their shelter, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had made it through one of the worst moments of their lives. They were safe and they were together. That evening, as the sky cleared and the sun began to set over the devastated landscape, they sat on the remains of their porch and processed what had happened to their world. The morning after the storm brought with it a kind of eerie stillness. The sun rose over a landscape that had been transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a thriving ranch with sprawling fields, healthy crops, and sturdy structures was now a wasteland of destruction. The smell of fresh-cut wood mixed with the earthy scent of overturned soil hung heavy in the air. Birds were beginning to call out tentatively, as if questioning whether it was truly safe to emerge from their hiding places. James woke on the cot they had set up in what remained of their living room. The rest of the house was too damaged to safely inhabit. He had spent much of the night assessing the damage, trying to come to terms with the scale of destruction that surrounded their property. His mind had been racing with thoughts about what came next, how they would rebuild, whether they even should rebuild at this point in their lives. Margaret was already awake when he stirred. She stood at the edge of what used to be their kitchen, looking out through the gaping hole in the wall where their entire back section had been demolished. She held 2 cups of coffee that she had somehow managed to prepare using a camping stove they had kept in the shelter. Her face was haggard with exhaustion and the emotional weight of what they were facing. They stood together in silence, not needing words to communicate the gravity of their situation. The insurance process would take months, possibly years. The physical labor required to clean up and rebuild was almost incomprehensible. James was 53 years old and Margaret was 51. They weren't young anymore, and the prospect of starting over from scratch felt almost overwhelming. By mid-morning, emergency crews had begun to arrive in the area. Fire departments, rescue personnel, and utility workers were making their way through the devastated community, assessing damage, checking on residents, and beginning the initial cleanup efforts. A young sheriff's deputy drove up their long driveway in a dust cloud and checked on them, making sure they were safe and didn't need immediate assistance. James and Margaret explained that they were fine, that they had sheltered properly, and that they didn't need medical attention. The deputy told them that 3 people had been killed in the county, including a family of 2 adults and a child who had been in their mobile home when the tornado hit. 12 others had been injured, some seriously. The storm had touched down in 5 different locations, creating a path of destruction that was approximately 30 miles long and several miles wide. It was, the deputy said, one of the worst storms to hit their area in over 40 years. Over the next few days, James and Margaret's community came together in a way that reminded them why they had always loved living in this rural area. Neighbors who themselves had suffered significant damage came to help assess what could be salvaged. The pastor from their small church organized a community cleanup effort. Local contractors and volunteers began the process of helping residents assess their losses and start the planning process for rebuilding. For James, the days following the storm were a blur of activity and decision-making. He worked with insurance adjusters, met with construction contractors, coordinated with county officials, and began the physical work of clearing debris from his property. The labor was back-breaking, and every evening he would collapse into bed, his muscles aching in ways he hadn't experienced in years. But as days turned into weeks, something else began to happen. Other storms began to form in the atmosphere. The jet stream had set up in such a way that the same conditions that had created the initial devastating tornado were beginning to repeat themselves. Meteorologists noted that another significant storm system was developing and would move into the same region within the next week. By the second week after the first storm, weather forecasters were already beginning to issue alerts about the incoming system. The models all suggested that this second storm could potentially be even more severe than the first one. The atmospheric conditions were nearly identical, and in some ways they were even more favorable for the development of violent, rotating supercell thunderstorms. The community, already reeling from the first impact, began to experience a sense of dread and anxiety. People who had just begun the process of cleaning up and rebuilding suddenly faced the prospect of having that work undone, potentially losing structures that had been spared in the first storm, or that had been partially repaired. James found himself dealing with a new kind of problem. The weather forecast suggested that the next storm might take a slightly different path, one that could impact their area even more directly than the first storm had. He spent hours studying weather maps and storm track predictions, trying to understand the probability and potential impact of the incoming system. Margaret, watching her husband's growing anxiety, tried to maintain a sense of calm and perspective. She urged him not to worry about what might happen, to focus instead on what they could control in the present moment. But even she couldn't deny the growing sense of apprehension that was settling over their community. The anxiety reached a peak about 3 days before the forecast predicted the most severe portion of the storm would arrive. The National Weather Service issued a special statement urging all residents in the projected impact area to make preparations and to be ready to seek shelter. Emergency management officials began setting up community shelters in schools and public buildings. The local news was beginning to cover the story with increasing intensity. James decided that he wanted to take one more comprehensive look at their property and their home before the storm arrived. He wanted to understand exactly what might be at greatest risk and whether there were any additional preparations they could make. He spent most of one afternoon walking the boundaries of their property, examining the structures that remained standing, checking the stability of trees that had been weakened by the first storm, and assessing whether any trees or dead branches posed particular hazards. Margaret observed his anxiety with concern. She recognized in her husband the signs of a man who was beginning to feel like he was losing control of his own life and his own property. The first storm had been something that simply happened to them, something they could not have predicted or prevented. But this second storm, this was different. This was a storm they saw coming, and it felt almost personal in its approach. On the day before the main storm system was expected to arrive, James made a decision that would reveal the depths of his feelings about his land and his home. As evening approached and the sky began to darken with the advancing weather system, he told Margaret that he wanted to go out and document their property one more time. He wanted to take photographs and video of everything, not for insurance purposes this time, but to preserve memories in case the worst happened. Margaret felt a chill run through her as she listened to her husband. She understood that he was preparing mentally for the possibility of losing everything. In some ways, she had already done that mental preparation. She had lived long enough to understand that possessions could be replaced, but her life with James, their time together, their shared memories, these things could not be replaced. She wanted to focus on preserving those things rather than on trying to protect structures and property. But she said nothing to James about her concerns. Instead, she helped him gather the camera equipment he wanted to take with him. She made him promise to be back well before the storm system reached their area. He gave his word, kissing her gently on the forehead before heading out into the gathering darkness. James spent several hours that evening photographing their property. He took pictures of the house, the areas they had managed to repair, the remaining outbuildings, the fields that stretched toward the horizon. He took videos walking through the spaces they had inhabited for so many years. He stopped at the old oak tree in the yard, the one Margaret had planted as a young woman, and he put his hand on its trunk as if he could somehow transfer its strength to his own being. When he finally came back inside, it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The wind was already beginning to pick up noticeably, and the barometer was dropping steadily. Weather updates on the radio indicated that the storm system was moving faster than predicted and could arrive in the area during the late evening hours rather than in the early morning as originally forecast. They prepared their shelter once again, bringing down the same supplies they had gathered before the first storm. The difference this time was that their preparations felt less like a precaution and more like a resignation. They both seemed to accept that this storm would likely cause significant additional damage to their already compromised home. As the evening progressed and they sat together in their living room, James found himself thinking about something his father had once told him. His father, who had also been a rancher, had said that a man's worth was not measured by what he owned or what he had built, but by who he was and how he treated others. At the time, James had thought it was an easy thing for his father to say, as his father had been quite successful and had accumulated considerable wealth. But now, as he faced the prospect of losing much of what he had spent his lifetime building, he began to understand the wisdom in those words. Margaret watched her husband's face as he seemed lost in thought. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "we face it together. That's all that really matters." James nodded, unable to find words that could adequately express the depth of emotion he was feeling. He pulled his wife close, and they held each other as the wind outside continued to intensify and the darkness deepened around them. The rain began to fall around midnight, starting gently but gradually increasing in intensity. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the wind had reached sustained speeds of over 60 miles per hour, with gusts that made the partially destroyed house creak and sway in ways that sent waves of anxiety through both James and Margaret. They remained in their shelter, listening to weather updates on a battery-powered radio and monitoring the path of the storm system as it moved inexorably toward their location. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the National Weather Service issued a particularly urgent warning. A strong to violent tornado was being tracked moving directly toward their county and was expected to impact the area within the next 30 to 40 minutes. The rotation being detected on the Doppler radar was extremely strong, suggesting that this storm would likely produce a significant tornado with potentially catastrophic damage. James and Margaret held each other in the darkness of their shelter, listening to the sound of the rain and wind intensifying outside. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and there was a strange electric feeling to the air that suggested the presence of severe weather overhead. They had both been through the previous storm, so they thought they knew what to expect. What they didn't know was that this storm would present them with a choice that would force James to confront the question of what he truly valued in his life. Around 2:45 in the morning, their worst fears were realized. The sound that came to their ears was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was not just the sound of wind, but a deep, almost mechanical roaring that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. This was the sound of a tornado in the immediate vicinity, and it was terrifyingly close. The shelter shook violently. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling. Items that they had stored in the shelter tumbled from shelves. For several minutes, the intensity of the shaking was so severe that James wasn't certain the shelter structure itself would hold. He threw his body over Margaret, covering her with his own frame, trying to protect her from whatever debris might fall. Then, after what seemed like an impossibly long time, but was actually only a few seconds, the worst of the shaking began to diminish. The roaring sound began to fade. The violent shudders of the shelter became less intense. Within a minute, the storm had passed. The sound still continued to be loud, but it was no longer at the catastrophic level it had just reached. James slowly lifted himself up and checked on Margaret. She was shaken and frightened, but she appeared to be physically unharmed. He helped her to her feet, and they stood together in the darkness, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. James tentatively began to climb the stairs to the main level of the house. What he found was almost impossible to comprehend. The tornado had completely destroyed what remained of their home. The entire structure was now essentially gone. The walls, the roof, the floors, everything had been reduced to scattered debris. It was as if a giant hand had picked up their house and crushed it like an empty cardboard box. But that wasn't the most pressing concern at that moment. As James looked around at the devastation, he noticed something else. One of the large storage buildings that stood away from the main house, a barn that had survived the first storm with only minor damage, had also been impacted by the tornado. But more importantly, he realized that Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, their elderly neighbor whose own home had been destroyed in the first storm, had been staying in what they thought was a safe shelter structure they had provided for her on the edge of their property. The shelter structure was now crushed, reduced to twisted metal and splintered wood. James's heart nearly stopped. Eleanor had mentioned to him that afternoon that she wasn't feeling well, but she might go to rest early. He had assumed she would go to the main house where they could monitor her and make sure she was safe. But now he was uncertain whether she was even aware that the second storm was approaching with such severity. He rushed back down to the shelter where Margaret was standing, her face pale with shock. "Eleanor!" he said urgently. "We need to find Eleanor." I don't think she made it to the house before this hit. The two of them had taken responsibility for their elderly neighbor after her home had been destroyed in the first storm. She had nowhere else to go, and they had invited her to stay with them. The weight of that responsibility suddenly crashed down on both of them with terrible force. Without waiting for any further discussion, James climbed back up into the wreckage and began to move quickly through the destroyed structure of what used to be their home. He was calling Eleanor's name, listening carefully for any response. The rain was still falling heavily, and the wind, while no longer at tornado strength, was still extremely strong. Margaret emerged from the shelter and began searching as well, calling Eleanor's name into the darkness and rain. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the debris field was treacherous. Pieces of wood and metal were scattered across the property in a vast radius from where the house had stood. After several agonizing minutes, James heard a faint sound coming from the direction of what used to be the main house. It was a voice, weak but unmistakable. He moved in that direction, carefully navigating through the debris field. There, partially buried under a section of wall and some wooden beams, was Eleanor Patterson. She was conscious, and remarkably, she didn't appear to be severely injured, though she had a nasty gash on her forehead and several deep cuts on her arms where the debris had struck her. She had, in fact, decided to go to the house to be with James and Margaret when the storm approached, but she had become disoriented in the darkness and the rain. She had taken shelter under a reinforced archway in what used to be the hallway, and by sheer luck, the structure of that particular part of the house had provided her with just enough protection to survive. James carefully began to remove the debris that covered her, working as gently as possible despite the urgency of the situation. Margaret appeared at his side with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and rain. Together they freed Eleanor from the debris and helped her to her feet. Eleanor was shaking badly, her voice trembling as she tried to thank them. "You saved my life," she kept repeating. "You found me in the dark. You saved my life." James realized that they needed to get Eleanor somewhere warm and dry as quickly as possible. The weather was still dangerous, and Eleanor needed proper medical attention for her wounds. He helped her to the truck that was parked some distance from the house, which, miraculously, seemed to have been largely spared the worst of the tornado's destruction. As James helped Eleanor into the truck and got her settled in the cab where Margaret was already waiting, something profound shifted in his perspective. As he looked out at the debris field that had once been the home and a life he had built over decades, he felt something unexpected. Instead of despair or rage at the loss, he felt gratitude. Eleanor was alive. Margaret was alive. He himself was alive. Everything else, as devastating as its loss was, could be rebuilt or replaced. But the lives of the people he loved could not be replaced. In that moment, James understood something that many people take a lifetime to learn, and some never learn at all. He started the truck and began to drive toward the main road, heading toward the hospital in the nearest town. Eleanor needed medical attention, and they needed to get to safety in case there were additional tornado warnings. As they drove through the devastated landscape, passing other destroyed homes and crushed vehicles, James thought about what came next. The insurance claims would eventually be settled. Rebuilding would take months, possibly years. There would be challenges and difficulties ahead that he couldn't even imagine at this moment. But when he thought about the future, he found that he wasn't thinking about rebuilding the structures on his land. Instead, he was thinking about what he and Margaret would do with the rest of their lives and how they could use their experience and their survival of this disaster to help others in similar situations. Over the subsequent weeks and months, a remarkable thing happened. As James and Margaret worked through the process of recovering from the disaster, they made a decision that surprised many people in their community. Instead of attempting to rebuild their sprawling ranch operation, they decided to use the insurance proceeds and their own savings to establish a disaster recovery center for people in their county and surrounding areas who had been impacted by tornadoes and other severe weather. James spent his days working with other disaster survivors, helping them navigate the insurance process, connecting them with contractors and disaster recovery resources, and providing emotional support based on his own experience. Margaret became involved in efforts to improve community shelter facilities and to help educate people about storm preparedness. Eleanor Patterson, who had fully recovered from her injuries, became something of an ambassador for the Disaster Recovery Center, sharing her story with anyone who would listen about how she had been saved by people who cared enough to search for her in the darkness. The Hayes' story spread throughout the community and beyond. News outlets picked up on the remarkable journey of this couple who had lost nearly everything but had transformed their tragedy into a calling to help others. What had initially seemed like a story of personal loss became a story of community resilience and human compassion. Years later, when people asked James Hayes about what he had learned from the experience of losing his home and his livelihood to two devastating tornadoes, he would always say the same thing. He would talk about how the storms had taught him that what truly matters in life is not what you own or what you build, but the relationships you maintain and the positive impact you can have on others' lives. Margaret would stand beside him when he shared this message, and she would squeeze his hand, remembering that terrible night when she had stood in the darkness listening to the roar of the tornado, and she had realized that all that truly mattered was that James was with her. The storms had taken their home, their land, and the life they had built, but they had given back something more valuable. They had given James and Margaret the clarity of understanding what truly deserved to be protected and preserved. In the end, the story of what happened when the tornado came was not a story about a man struggling to save his property or his possessions. It was a story about a man who realized in his moment of greatest loss that the only things truly worth saving were the lives and the love of the people he held dear. And in that realization, he found the strength to not just survive the disaster, but to grow beyond it and to help his community do the same. The ranch was never rebuilt in the way it had been before, but something was built in its place that was, in many ways, far more valuable. It was a place of healing, of recovery, and of hope for people who had experienced their own personal disasters. And it all began with the moment when a man pulled those he loved to safety and made the choice to focus on what truly mattered.